Thank you, everybody. Good morning. My name is John Hughes. I'm an editor for Bloomberg First Word. That's our breaking news desk here in Washington. I'm also the president of the National Press Club, and I want to welcome you today to this great event, this important event where we're really working to save lives, protect freelance journalists, and that's a very important thing for all of us to be doing. We don't need to say why it's important because the video that we've seen, the news reports from the Middle East, the horrific stories, that's why we're here today. I know there are many organizations represented here. Our club's Journalism Institute is working with the Investigative Reporting Workshop and the Committee to Protect Journalists. We also have members of our Press Freedom Committee here. Raise your hand if you're on the National Press Club Press Freedom. Okay, very good. And this is a very important function of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the press freedom work that we do. So we decided to make press freedom a much larger part of what the Institute does by moving the programs from the club over to the Institute. And this really is a kickoff to getting that started. And we're very excited for this program today. Now, before I finish, I want to do a little bit of breaking news. We're announcing, the National Press Club today is announcing that we're giving one of our most prestigious awards. This is the John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award, and we're giving this to Austin Tice. He's an American freelance reporter who's been detained in Syria since 2012. It is uncertain who holds him, but we believe that Austin is alive. He is sharing this award with Jason Rezaian of the Washington Post, who is being held in a Tehran jail. We are announcing these awards early to shine a spotlight on the plight of these two men, to raise our voices, to tell the world these men are journalists, they're doing their jobs, they should not be held, and they must go free. We're going to keep raising our voices. We're going to keep the pressure on, and we're going to keep supporting programs just like this to protect journalists and to ensure that this doesn't happen to any other people. We have a large gala dinner here at the Press Club in the summer where we give out these Press Freedom Awards. This year it will be July 29th over in the ballroom, and you are all invited to that dinner. And we hope that at that dinner, Austin Tice and Jason Rezaian can be here to collect these Press Freedom Awards in person. And we're going to work every day between now and then to add our voices with all of you to make sure that that happens. Thank you so much, and now I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Chuck Lewis.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event, and it's wonderful to be here. We have folks from literally different parts of Europe and different cities in the U.S., all here. We've all been discussing for months these issues of how to make life safer for journalists in the world, freelance journalists in particular, and we'll hear far more about that throughout the program. Right now, I'd like to introduce Barbara Cochran, who is a longtime veteran journalist, former CBS News Bureau Chief, professor at the moment at the University of Missouri, former president of the Radio and Television News Directors Association, and president of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. It's great to see you bright and early this morning. I think considering what the traffic is like in Northern Virginia, there may be others straggling in later on. As John Hughes said, one of the mandates of the National Press Club Journalism Institute is press freedom. And this is something that's always been part of our mission, which is to provide professional development and educational programming for the members of the press club and for other journalists. And we provide more than 50 programs every year that help journalists freshen their skills, explore important issues. And so the idea that we are now expanding our mandate to not only support press freedom through advocacy, but also to enhance our programming and increase our programming offerings in this area is really very, very important. And of course, what could be more essential to press freedom than the safety of journalists? So that's why having newly received this larger mandate to have the very first event be something that we're sharing with the Investigative Reporters Workshop and the Committee to Protect Journalists and all of you who've gathered together in an informal way to discuss this important topic. It's a great honor, a great privilege for us, and we're very, very happy that you're here today. Now I'll turn it back to Chuck.
Obviously, the last 2 years in this world of ours has been the most dangerous ever documented for journalists, which is why we're here. And there's no greater expert on the status of safety in the world for journalists than Robert Mahoney, who is here from New York, from the Committee to Protect Journalists, who before joining CPJ did reporting in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And so, and he also has something to announce today regarding a certain publication. So welcome, Rob. It's great to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Thank you also to the National Press Club Journalism Institute and to Chuck and his team and to all of you that have made this possible. My job here is actually a sad one, but it's also a necessary one, which is in a way to frame the discussion that we're going to be having later with some facts and figures on the situation for journalists and for journalism around the world. And when I quote statistics, I understand that behind every statistic is a person, maybe a colleague, a friend, a loved one that we have known. But it's true, in the last 3 years, from 2012 to 2014 at least, it's probably been the most dangerous time to be a journalist. In that time, the committee has documented at least 205 deaths of journalists, and believe me, our figures are pretty conservative, so there's probably more that have died in that time. And the big difference now that we notice in terms of journalists that are killed in hostile environments is that many of them are actually targeted because of what they're doing as journalists. It used to be that foreign correspondents, as they were once called, had a certain status that they could move across lines, that they could cover conflict without getting embroiled in that conflict. That, sadly, is fast becoming no longer the case. We have documented since the Syrian war broke out, for example, more than 90 hostage takings of journalists, and there are probably about 20 that we still believe are held captive. This is new. Journalists used to be taken hostage before, but there were far fewer numbers, and they were kept alive usually because there was some financial or political gain from holding a hostage that the abductors wanted. Unfortunately, that is not always the case now. And another interesting fact is that more and more foreign journalists are being killed and more journalists are dying in crossfire. We reckon that about half of those journalists that are now being killed are freelancers. That's a significant change too. As news organizations have shrunk their foreign news operations and their footprint overseas, they rely more and more on freelancer-generated content for their news, and freelancers are paying the price of that. But the biggest group, as we all know, that take the brunt of this are local journalists. They're the ones that are left behind, even if the foreign journalists can leave. And of particular relevance to the panel that we're going to be having this morning of the journalists that are dying or have been dying in the Middle East, about 6 out of 10 are in the visual field. About 4 out of 10 are camera operators, and 2 out of 10 are stills photographers. That also is an increase and reflects the dangers, because those journalists are the ones that do have to go to the front line. They do have to get the images. They do have to get the actuality, and they're the ones that are probably in more danger. So that's the framework in which we are here today. It's sad, but it has spurred us to try to do something. All of us in this room have done something. We give aid to journalists. We report on press freedom violations and the deaths of journalists, and we all do a little bit. Now I'm hoping that with this initiative, all those little bits can be brought together to make a big difference. The response has been great. It has opened up debate in the news industry. For the first time in a long time, we are questioning the wisdom of news blackouts when it comes to the abduction of journalists. The issue of ransom payment has come up, and the behavior of governments towards the families of journalists that have been abducted is also now a topic for discussion. And I'm hoping that I see some signs that there is a move afoot within the US government, for example, to change the way that it behaves so that families like the Foleys and Diane Foley never have to go through what they did again at the hands of governments when it comes to seeking help to get their loved ones out. So that's a brief overview of the needs. We've assessed the needs. Now comes the hard part. How do we meet them? I hope that today we'll get some answers to that. Thank you very much.
Before introducing our next speaker, I do want to say hello and acknowledge Diane Foley, and we're honored by your presence here. And thank you. So anyway, David Rode is our next speaker. He's not your typical journalist. It's fair to say he has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He was taken hostage a few years ago in Afghanistan for 8 months and escaped. A remarkable story, a remarkable career. And anyway, David is now at Reuters after a time for years at the New York Times. So anyway, David, without further ado, we will then discuss freelance photography, an aspect that's been neglected, frankly, in some of the earlier conversations going back to August and September, and that's the subject of this panel. And we have some distinguished panelists who, obviously, David will introduce. So without further ado, David. Thanks.
I'm going to quickly speak, but our panelists are going to have a seat here, and then I will moderate a conversation with them about photojournalism. What I wanted to do is just thank first John and Julie and everyone from the National Press Club for arranging this, and Chuck Lewis has done an amazing job literally making all this happen. It all started with Chuck. It was an anonymous donor who wanted something to be done in the wake of the murder of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff that resulted in us being here today. My sort of quick update is I'm just sort of thrilled and amazed at where we are in terms of these guidelines. A small group of us gathered in Chicago. Initially, it was a meeting arranged by the AP managing editors. John Danishevsky from AP is here, and the International Press Institute. John Yearwood, who's sitting here as well, helped arrange that conversation, and we never thought we would be able to draft guidelines, let alone get people to sign on. We unveiled the guidelines, or the call, I should say, on February 12th at Columbia University in New York with roughly 24 signatories. We nearly tripled that number in the last 2 months. I'm incredibly proud and happy to say we now have over 60 signatories. Last night we got 2 more signatories, and what's amazing about the turnout is that it's overwhelmingly from journalist associations in some of the most dangerous countries in the world. That was reflected last night. We got a new signatory a Mexican journalist group called, and excuse my pronunciation, Periodista de a Pie, and the second group to sign on last night was the Iraqi Journalist Rights Defense Association. We have signatories from 10 countries. I mentioned danger. They include the Philippines, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Argentina, and as I mentioned, Mexico and Iraq. And at the same time, we have, I think, an impressive response from the news industry. 15 major organizations have signed on, including 5 of the world's largest news organizations. That would be AP, AFP, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the BBC, and many others as well, and we can talk more about that. I'm now going to quickly sit down and start this panel discussion because we really are here to talk about photojournalism, and I'm honored to be with this group. Thank you. I will do just a quick introduction of the panel. I'm thrilled. Can I say a rock star panel? Is that fair? No, they're not smiling. Okay. I'm not a photojournalist. I'm a scribbler, as they say, a writer. So I've always been sort of intimidated by photographers, and it's continuing this morning. Lily Hindi, who's to my left, is the Deputy Director of Risk, Reporters Instructed in Saving Colleagues. They offer a tremendous program of training journalists on first aid, how to save yourself and help your colleagues. Emma Beals is a founder and director of the Frontline Freelance Register. That's a London-based group that now represents over 500 freelancers who work often in conflict zones. Allison Shelley, the next panel member, is the co-director of Women Photojournalists of Washington and a very accomplished photojournalist herself, a freelance photojournalist. And then Ron Haviv is a co-founder of the 7 Photo Agency and a close friend, and I'm sort of thrilled, and thank you all for coming this morning. The theme today is sort of the unprecedented challenges and dangers that photojournalists face, so I just wanted to start out by asking each of you, and we'll just sort of work our way down, starting with Lily. Can you talk about what you see from your personal perspective or from your organization's perspective as the single largest challenge that, that photojournalists face today, particularly freelancers?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I'm not a photographer, but RISC has trained at this point 215 journalists around the world, and about 80% of them have been photographers. So the photographers are the ones that are getting, you know, the closest to the action. They're putting themselves in a lot of danger. So we've spoken to a lot of photojournalists, and I think the biggest complaint that's come up has been that it's a buyer's market. This is true about freelancers in general, but there's a glut of photographers out there right now, and there's not enough, you know, support. There's not enough news agencies or general outlets that will pay people enough for their work. So, yeah, that's what I think it is, the buyer's market dilemma.
Emma?
Well, we're a representative organization, so I did a quick poll of our photographer members to come up with an answer for you. One of the big concerns was trying to explain to mom what it is they do for a job, but that was closely followed by money. It's all about the money, basically. And that sort of came in a variety of ways. So it was being paid fairly for the work that they're doing, being paid expenses, and being paid in a timely fashion. So there is a problem with once, you know, people have arranged a price that they're going to charge for their work, it takes a long, long time to get paid. You know, I personally constantly chase invoices for sort of $200 8 months later. You know, and at that point, you've spent $200 worth of labor time chasing the invoice alone, let alone paying your fixer and your, you know, whatever else. There's also a tendency to pay photographers in conflict zones similarly to how you would pay a photographer in a non-conflict zone when the expenses associated with that kind of work are vastly different. So if you go and do a shot in Washington, you know, you might pay for your cab and your equipment and your time. If you're in Gaza, your costs are just vastly different, and that's not always calculated in the rates that organizations are paying. So for freelancers, it's all about the money. You know, the support networks and all of these things are nice. If they're paid better, they can afford them themselves. So it's all about the money.
Thank you. Allison?
I think I would echo what my colleagues are saying here. I think there's a real fundamental disconnect between what's happening in the field and what outlets are willing to pay. And as was just said, I think they get away with it because there are so many people who are willing to provide the content. But I think a lot of that has to do with not understanding fully what's involved in actually getting a picture, getting a story, and how many hours, days it may take to actually get to the subject you need, and the things that you're exposed to along the way, and what you need to do to protect yourselves. And it's not like working in a developing country is not the same as working in a more developed country, because you do have to protect yourself. You do have to, there's a lot more that's on the line there.
Ron, you and I are the older members of the panel. How has
So
it
back in the day,
exactly, no war stories. But how has it changed, and how has pay changed? I mean, everyone's mentioning that, but
well, I think one of the problems with pay hasn't changed. It's sort of the same that it's been
flat.
since the 1970s. I think that the market is obviously a very key issue in the survivability and viability of being a freelance photographer. And it permeates into different aspects of the freelancer's life, including, most importantly, the ability to protect oneself, both in terms of training and insurance and so on. And I think that we are in a place as a group of photographers around the world where we are struggling to be able to tell stories. And it's a difficulty in terms of finding places to place it, ability to survive financially. But there's also I think a lack of understanding by the newer generation of photographers, and this was the same when I came into the field, my colleagues, of really understanding what the dangers are that exist. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just in terms of covering a frontline situation. And I think that one of the things that is incredibly important that's come up in the last few years is raising awareness about really what can go wrong and what you need to do to be able to try to minimize those possibilities.
Ron, you mentioned training, and I didn't know, Lily, if you could talk specifically about what risk kind of teaches people, and because if people aren't familiar, what kind of training would help a photojournalist in the field?
Sure. So risk is a strictly medical training. So there's a lot of hostile environment courses out there. They've been around for a long time, but risks course is 4 days long, and we focus on the 4 preventable deaths on the battlefield, and that's based mostly on US military research. So since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been a lot of data about what kills people when they're in an active conflict zone. So those deaths are, without getting too technical, the first one, the most obvious, and the large majority of deaths are from bleeding. So the reason that RISK was founded was after the deaths of Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros, Sebastian Younger, who was a good friend of Tim Hetherington, heard from a combat medic that Tim may not have succumbed to his wounds if someone around him had the training to stop the bleeding. So it seems pretty basic, but when you're in the moment and when you're in shock, and people need this training to know how to save someone's life. So number 1 is bleeding. Number 2 is airway, blocked airway. Number 3 is a tension pneumothorax, which is something that happens when you have a shrapnel or gunshot wound to the chest cavity. And then the last thing is hypothermia, even in very warm climates. So risks training goes very in depth into these 4 preventable deaths, and we give all of our graduates a medical kit that they can take with them into the field. It's kind of an unspoken agreement we have with our graduates that when they've finished, they must go into conflict zones with this kit or with an equivalent kit. Yeah.
And I want to sort of focus on some positive things. So Emma, the existence of the Freelance Register, in a sense, is a step forward. That you have 500 members. If you can just talk about the group, what you're trying to achieve as a group. You've obviously mentioned pay, but are there other issues? And is it encouraging that there is this kind of organization among freelancers?
Yeah, well, I mean, we set up the FFR sort of inspired by some of the things that were happening in Syria, which was that a lot of news organizations were panicking and saying, we just won't take any freelance material from Syria at all, blanket ban, which isn't necessarily representative of an agile response to risk. And so we wanted to bring together those people who were working in those areas to talk about some of those issues and to show that we're capable of taking responsibility for our own safety and that we're capable of being part of the conversation about our own safety. We don't want to be talked about, we want to talk with folks and make sure that we all come to a solution that assists all of us. So news organizations want news, we want work, people want to be safe. So giving a representative body that can come to meetings like this, and we're grateful to be invited and to be part of those conversations, means that freelancers are part of that conversation, and also shows a willingness on the part of those 500 people that they are prepared to sign up to a code of conduct when they join the organization that says, I will, undertake certain code of ethics in my reporting, as well as, a set of safety standards, and be willing to work towards improving those safety standards for themselves. That helps an employer who can look at them and say, well, these people have said that they're serious about journalism. They're not, there is a bit of a perception about freelancers, particularly, in the wake of the Arab Spring, that they're all just crazy kids with iPhones, which certainly isn't, representative of what's happening. If you look at what, the makeup of the news industry, so much content is coming from freelancers. So organizations need that serious freelance work, and freelancers also have a responsibility to demonstrate that they are serious themselves. And an organization like ours offers them the opportunity to sort of put their hand up and indicate that they are, a serious player, and to join conversations like this and show willingness to be part of that conversation and not just sort of be talked about.
And just to explain, for people that don't know about the guidelines, it's essentially a pledge, 7 from freelancers themselves and 7 from news organizations. A large part of the 7 from freelancers actually comes from the code of conduct that the Frontline Freelancer Register adopted itself for its members. So it says that they will get training so that they can protect themselves and their colleagues if they go into a conflict zone, first aid training, hazardous environment training, that the freelancer will try to do a careful risk assessment before they make any trip into a dangerous area. On the news organization side, they pledge to try to factor in the cost of safety training and safety issues into the pay rates for people. And they also talk about how there is a moral responsibility for the news organization that if something does go wrong, if someone is injured, or killed or kidnapped, that the news organization has a role in terms of trying to help that person. We're trying to get away from vague conversations from editors and freelancers before they go into these risky assignments to talk specifically. And one of the things we're talking about is training editors about how to handle this better. But what is the news organization going to pay? What are the expenses that they're going to cover? What insurance coverage is there, if any, for the freelancer? And what will and won't the news organization do before a freelancer takes on a dangerous assignment? So that's the goal, and I just applaud the Freelance Register for its own code of conduct.
We hope for, our purpose of signing on to those standards was, in the hope that it would embolden freelancers to start that conversation with editors. So if someone is working with one of the organizations that has signed onto those standards, this little freelancer who isn't in a hugely powerful bargaining position can start that conversation more simply and sort of put their hand up and say, well, did you want to read my risk assessment, sir? Are you going to pay for my insurance? And start that conversation in a more useful way, because sometimes that power imbalance, the freelancer is just grateful for the work, but we want to sort of try and upset that a little bit and have both parties talking about these issues before someone goes off to a dangerous area.
Allison, and I'm trying to also emphasize, again, some positive things here. You have found a way to not just do conflict photojournalism, and you sort of do that, I think, intentionally sometimes. I was on a panel before with you, but can you talk about that there are maybe other routes to be a successful photojournalist that don't involve simply risking your life?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of stories to be told, and I think that there are a lot of people out there doing them, and maybe it's less glamorous. I personally do a lot of work on global health issues. That's most of what I do. I try not to do conflict on purpose because I don't think I'd be very good, have very good instincts with that. But yeah, I think there are a lot of deep stories that need to be told. And at the same time, you know, because you're in a situation that is unfamiliar, that may, you know, maybe a different culture. It may just be that you're in an unstable environment. You're at risk in some way, and it may not be bullets, and it may not be, you know, direct conflict, but you can face pretty sketchy things just covering a health story. Ron and I actually in Haiti were in a situation in which we were covering the cholera outbreak and had some people who didn't quite understand what was going on chase us with rocks, and the car that Ron was in got its windows broken with rocks, and one of the men who was with us was kidnapped and nearly killed. And you know, these things are just sort of what happens when you're covering things in foreign countries. So it all goes together.
But you feel there's a market out there for imagery that's not just about conflict?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the world is big and wide, and there are many things to talk about. I think it's harder to, maybe, I don't know. I find it hard to sell global health imagery sometimes. It's a hard sell. It's not very sexy or glamorous, but I personally think it's important.
And Ron, and we're going till 10:45, and I'm going to open up to questions, but I want to ask a few more questions. Can you just talk about how it's changed in terms of safety-wise? I mean, you and I started out in the 90s, you first in Panama, and then we were both in Bosnia, but sort of the way journalists are perceived on the ground, and you know, photographers in particular, by combatants, let's say, in conflicts, or by even local governments, how has that changed over the last 15 years?
Well, I think for our generation, sort of the generation that came out of, let's say, the Yugoslavian conflict, we witnessed this change pretty much on the ground in Bosnia to a large degree. And I think one of the main reasons this started happening was because of the advent of satellite television, where all of a sudden the combatants were starting to see the news of what was being produced about them right where they were, while the journalists were still around. And quite often they would not be very appreciative of the coverage. And they would take out their anger on not necessarily the crew that did that report, but basically whoever showed up next. And we started to become targets. And that became, it became quite difficult. In combination, Yugoslavia was also a conflict where the journalists were basically able to drive from a cafe in Vienna, and 6 hours later, they would be at a front line. And so you had a lot of people that really didn't know what they were doing in very difficult situations. And I include myself in that in the beginning. And a lot of people made very unfortunate mistakes that they paid for with their lives. And as the death toll and wounded toll mounted in the Bosnian War, the networks and the large organizations started to take it quite seriously. And this is where the hostile environment courses started to come out. The Rory Peck Fund obviously came in the, I guess, 94, 95. And this idea of like, we needed to understand what we were doing became quite relevant. All of a sudden we were wearing flak jackets, armored cars were being driven in. The BBC took all the armored cars from Northern Ireland, brought them in into Bosnia. And this basically became a bit of the standard of the new way of working. And for the freelancer, quite often, who could not afford to rent an armored car, could barely afford to get a flak jacket, and if you didn't have the subsidy from Rory Peck, get the training in hostile environment and first aid trauma, there became a large gap that still exists to this day to some degree.
And how did the different sort of factions on the ground view journalists? I would say in Bosnia versus how they're viewed in Syria.
I think that people were becoming very conscious of the role of the messenger. And it was becoming, and is still, and even more so today, obviously, given everybody can see what you're doing on their phone, it is becoming incredibly difficult to work, especially in visual media, where they are very conscious of what's going on. So you now have people that are, let's say when they go into Syria to get accredited, let's say by the FSA, they're immediately Googled, and the FSA wants to know what their reputation is. And then when they leave Syria, they're Googled again to see what they did while they were there. So this is making things incredibly difficult to work in these situations. And this is also now spreading, obviously, not only to situations of combat, but generally other situations as well, where everybody's incredibly, what did you do? What kind of picture did you take? What are you saying about me?
Are there more, and a question for all of you, I mean, a positive thing from the web would be that there should be more outlets. It should be easier than ever to get photographs published. Is that true? They don't pay as much, but it's easy. Is it easier than, one thing I've heard is that, you know, it's easier than ever to get your work online, but it's very difficult to get paid a serious amount for it. Is that fair?
I think to an extent that probably is fair. There's obviously a huge desire for content now, and there's just not, they have people, and it's not just against photographers, people are having obviously difficulty figuring out how to monetize this new market. And so photography is probably one of the most expendable first sort of budget lines that gets cut.
And Emma, do you feel like also that factions and governments now feel they can just go to their sort of public directly themselves? They don't need journalists so much to get their story out? Or they still, when we were in Bosnia, we're telling war stories, but there was a sense that the sides wanted to kind of trick they were annoyed with the journalists, but they wanted to trick the journalists into telling their version, their narrative of the conflict, and they kind of needed us to get their message out.
Well, now
I haven't, you worked in Syria, is that?
Well, now you're kind of this pesky annoyance that wants to tell the truth. So, I mean, all the factions in Syria have their own media departments, and they put out their footage of different battles with their particular faction's logo in the corner, which, you know, as a journalist trying to report that story is very difficult because you're using material that's inherently biased towards the group that's made it. But their feeling is that they don't need you, which is interesting. I mean, I was in Syria a while back, and one of the group that I was with who were protecting me did one of the biggest sort of military successes that they had achieved with a whole bunch of foreign journalists in another room and didn't tell us about it until afterwards and filmed it themselves and offered us the footage. So there was just a complete misunderstanding of what our role in that might have been, and we were flabbergasted by the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, they don't need us. So if you're expendable, then there's not really so much of a requirement to assist you or to protect you. It kind of becomes that the ones who are trying to pony up to the West are the ones that take you in because it looks nice if they're caring about press freedom. But that's more about politicking than anything to do with journalism.
So Lily, Risk has made a specific proposal regarding pay. I just didn't know if you could sort of describe what that proposal is, the numbers, and also I think there was a specific amount that some outlets are paying, and we won't name the outlet, for one photograph.
Yeah.
The hard numbers, please.
Yeah, so back in January, after we had a meeting about these guidelines at the State Department, Sebastian and I came back to our alumni, and we told them that you know, we want to know what they're getting paid, we want to know what they want to get paid, and we want to know you know, generally their comments about pay. Ironically, antitrust laws prevent freelancers from collective bargaining, and they also prevent news agencies from talking about price fixing. These are illegal things to do. So Risk, as a nonprofit, you know, without breaking the law, we can kind of talk about this openly. We're not claiming to represent anyone in the same way that FFR does, but we have 215 alumni, and we're, you know, kind of tied into the network. So we did this survey. There was a wide range of payments, and we did it for print, photo, and video, and a couple of radio reporters. The rate that David is referring to that's appalling was that one young photographer was paid $25 for a photo from an active conflict zone, which is just mind-blowing. And that's just one number, but I'm sure Emma can attest, and maybe Allison and Ron, that that's not so crazy for what's being paid right now. And so we came up with, based on the numbers that we were getting from them, and we understand that the news agencies' budgets are struggling, and they have been for a while, and we're not trying to be adversarial about it, but we believe that pay is tied to safety, and that in general, kind of as Ron was saying, it helps for creativity when you have a glut of photographers and everyone's competing and everyone wants to stand out, that they are willing to get their photos printed, maybe published for not that much money or no money for the exposure. But when you're talking about paying someone $25 when they're working in a conflict zone and not checking with them about their training, about their insurance, about, any kind of responsibility they're taking for themselves, that's reckless and that's irresponsible. And since it is a buyer's market and the news agencies have the upper hand, we think it's up to them to kind of, take responsibility here. And the FFR has come up with this code of conduct. The guidelines are being made as well. But it's clear that it's kind of the news agency's turn to, take responsibility for this issue. So the numbers that we came up with after our survey were a day rate of photographers of $400, $1.50 per word for print, and $700 day rate for video. And there's a few other specifics in this statement that we put out. It's available on our website. We kind of said, if you expect freelancers to get trained and to have insurance and to be taking responsibility for themselves so that people aren't dying in conflict zones, then you need to pay them enough so they're not cutting corners while they're there. And that's all I'll say now. I'm getting excited.
Thank you. So Allison, is that $400 a day? Is that realistic? I mean, will
I think it depends where you are too. I really do. I think that's a great baseline. I think it's more than many outlets are currently paying. I think a place, for example, I did some work in Lagos, Nigeria recently. You can't get a hotel room for less than like $150 a night, bottom, and at any level. And so, I think, and that's not a conflict zone necessarily. So I think it just depends on where you are. But I think it's a great place to start.
And there's a sort of a two-tiered pay structure I've heard where if you're in a magazine or in a print product, the photograph, you get paid more. And then if it's digital only, a digital exclusive, I think is the term used sometimes. And can you talk about the difference between those rates? Yeah,
the online rates, the digital rates are much lower. And I think part of the problem is that editors don't always distinguish between original and non-original content. And so, I'm often offering, and part of this issue here is that, once a picture has been published in an outlet with a story, in a publication, it's not necessarily that another publication in the United States, at least, is not that excited to see the same picture and, a related story. And so, you often have one shot to publish that picture unless it's something spectacular or, certainly within my field, that my sort of beat, that's the case. And so it's certainly not uncommon to be offered like $50 a picture for an online use, and that can be, I travel often with writers, and so the writers paid for their story, and I don't always know what those rates are, but they may want one picture, they may want two, and $50 is not uncommon for that kind of thing. And it may double for a print product. It may be a little higher, but the numbers can be pretty low.
And there's certain outlets, and we're intentionally not naming outlets. Like, this is a very constructive, I think, the whole conversation we're having today. the guidelines, FFR's code of conduct, what risk is proposed in terms of pay is to have a dialogue. So but without naming outlets, there's some outlets that you've decided personally you will not work for because of the pay rate.
Absolutely.
But is that realistic? I mean, what's your advice to a young photographer? They've got to make their name. Should they sell some photographs for $25?
I think that's a personal choice. I think given all that we've discussed, I think it's a bad idea. I mean, my personal view would be that the best thing would be for all of us to have a united front and just say, no, we're not going to work for these publications, and I think that would change things pretty quickly. Realistically, I don't imagine that's going to happen anytime soon. So I think it behooves those of us who've been around for a little bit longer and have sort of a slightly more bird's eye view of things to be the ones to do that and do it very vocally. Because I think a lot of the younger photographers are looking to us to understand how to do things. And I think if those of us, who are able can say no, maybe that will start the ball rolling.
And Ron, do you think that's possible? I'm curious, are there more photographers now than 15 or 20 years ago? Is there more cohesion or less cohesion among photographers on these issues?
I think actually there's more cohesion. Photographers actually are horrific business people. We do not know what we're doing. Over the course of the last 10 years, one of the things that's happened, Seven was founded in the spirit of what Magnum was. It's owned by photographers, and other photographers have grouped together, like at Noor and Prime and other places like that. And one of the ideas, at least certainly behind Seven forming, was this trying to create a unified front in terms of business and use the marketing power of the photographers to better our business lives. And I think the photographers are slowly starting to understand that more. But that being said, I think that it's very difficult for a young photographer coming out of school to understand the damage that they're doing to the marketplace when they're accepting these low rates because they're living with 6 people in a loft in Williamsburg, that it's going to affect them 5 years later when they're trying to buy their first apartment. And it's a very hard line, and it is, as Allison said, it's a personal choice. But when I explain to a film writer, a screenwriter, or a director the way that we photographers work, they think we're the stupidest people in the world. They don't understand why there's no union. They don't understand why there's no minimums. They don't understand why we, as an industry, are continuously undercutting each other. And then when you add on top of that, we're doing it also in situations where our lives are at risk and we're taking serious chances, it becomes even more difficult to understand.
And there is no union. I mean, have there been efforts in the past to create, not even a union, but an association, something?
There's ASMP, APA, these are different organizations of photographers, but they don't have enough leverage to affect the marketplace as much as one would hope.
And I just want to ask one more question before opening it up. Emma, who you do print work, is that rate is $1.50? Is that close to what people get? Is it realistic? Will editors laugh at that amount?
I have one outlet that pays me $1 a word, and they're my favorite outlet. And I've pretty much quit writing because you can't live unless you're unless you're one of the sort of little club of people who are writing for the big magazines. You can't live as a freelancer writing. It's just not possible. So I'm doing video work. Video work's very well paid. Photographers fall somewhere in the middle. And I think when we have this conversation, it's important to differentiate between the various crafts. Writers get a really raw deal. It's terribly paid. Some of the biggest public papers in Britain are paying $100 a piece.
For how many words?
For a news piece. Front page, news piece from a regular stringer that they know, $100.
And you had mentioned that it was also, and this has come up earlier, but they'll pay the same rate for someone reporting in Cairo and someone who's reporting in London.
Yeah, so most of the papers will have standard rates per word, and that sticks no matter where you are. Quite often, the writer will have to take photos because I've been paid $25 a picture because they don't want to send a photographer, and you're the writer, and you have this camera, and could you just snap a couple of pictures while you're there? And then you're sort of doing the math, thinking, well, I'm getting paid 25 cents a word, so an extra $50 from 2 photos would mean that I can afford the hotel tonight. And you start to do the math, and it doesn't really stack up. But I think on the issue of younger photographers and things, there's a need to talk a little bit about what the options are for building your craft and becoming a good photographer and a good business person before you take yourself off to a war zone and attempted to sell those pictures for $25 to get published for the first time. There's a lot of ways into the craft where you can build your reputation, assisting well-known photographers, all the sorts of things that you would have done before freelancers became the market, by joining your local newspaper and working your way up. There's kind of this impression that you can just skip all of those steps by getting on a plane. And the result is that you have people who are prepared to publish for nothing or $25 because they haven't been published. So if we're sort of a bit more open about internship opportunities or assisting opportunities, or the fact that there is no shame in building up your portfolio as a photojournalist in the city that you live in, or by stringing in a not as dangerous but sort of low living cost kind of environment, so that when you do dive into conflict zones, your career is at a point where you don't feel embarrassed demanding an appropriate rate for your work, because you're not sort of so excited that you're getting something published in a newspaper that you're prepared to take virtually no money for it.
Thank you. And one last positive note before I take questions. There are, one of our goals in all these conversations is to talk about the resources that are out there for freelancers, and there are positive things happening. The Pulitzer Center, Tom Hundley is here, he's a senior editor, and he's in the back row. They are very successful as a nonprofit in sort of raising money, and they provide travel grants to freelancers. They require you to have an assignment with an outlet, but you can get thousands of dollars, in some cases, as much as $10,000 if you pitch a story to the Pulitzer Center, get the travel grant. You have to also have a confirmed assignment from a news organization, not just going to let somebody go out and have a trip. You have to produce journalism from it. So the Pulitzer Center is a very successful and growing resource. Charlie Sennett, who's going to moderate the next panel, is establishing now the Ground Truth Project. That's almost a field training experience for young journalists to go together in small groups to write stories together and cover broad topics. They're very successful. Story Hunter is represented here by Jared. They are a website that is sort of it's a website. It's using technology. I don't want to mention Uber, but it matches freelancers, a huge database of freelancers, their skills, their interests, their geographic expertise and language, and then editors can look at that, and Story Hunter tries to sort of match them together online. That's an exciting new development with technology that can hopefully improve things. So, good news as well. I wanted to open it up for questions. I have more questions myself, but go ahead. If you can, just first introduce yourself and then fire away.
Frank Smythe, Global Journal Security. I have one quick point and then a question for Lily. Pay is essential, but so is insurance. And I think a great many photojournalists, including very experienced journalists working the front lines, work without health insurance or life insurance. I know RSF offers a health insurance option, but the payout is quite low and would be inadequate for someone suffering needing long-term care from serious injury in the United States. So I'd like to sort of suggest to Elizabeth that this is one of the things that we should be considering long-term. The other thing is the point you made, Lily, about it would violate antitrust laws, presumably U.S. antitrust laws for freelancers to organize. I find that to be somewhat dubious. I'd like to know where you heard that, because I don't think there's any case law for that. I think that might be one lawyer's interpretation. If you go to a place like Syria or to the Ukraine, there would be journalists from different nationalities filing to outlets in different countries. So it's hard to imagine how U.S. law could even apply. So I'm just wondering where that came from, that it would violate any trust laws for freelancers to try to organize for better wages or for better rates.
Well, the person that I got it from was a lawyer who used to work with NPR, so he was, familiar with this kind of the media law. And as I understand, freelancers who are not employees of any agency cannot organize because they're free agents, and organizing and unionizing kind of violates free trade. It would put down competition if they all got together and they said to the news agencies, we're not going to work for you unless you pay us this amount of money. That's illegal.
This is his interpretation. He has nothing bad. There's no case law. He can't say because of this court ruling that
Actually,
I'm aware
he
of.
did point to a couple of court rulings, and I'd be happy to share them with you. I can't think of them off the bat, but.
Can I come back on your insurance point? Just to say that the whole reason I ended up starting FFR with some other colleagues was we just wanted some cheap insurance, and then it sort of spiraled out of control from there. And we have gone around and around and around on the insurance issue, trying to work out how we can create a situation where there's an affordable freelance product that covers kit, that covers life insurance, that covers medical insurance. And the only way we've been able to work it out is to become a brokerage in our own right. And we've got a few things to do before we become an insurance broker ourselves. So, I mean, if anyone ever feels like becoming an insurance broker in a not-for-profit kind of a way, or please talk to me. Or, that is a conversation we do need to have because it just doesn't exist. And folks will have medical insurance, but when they lose their camera, they have to get a grant to buy a new one because, there isn't an affordable kit insurance option. So it's the ongoing question, the insurance. And if anyone has any answers, I would love to hear them.
I think there's also a very important thing to add regarding insurance. RSF's insurance is great that it actually exists, but it doesn't actually apply to the local journalists. And I know that Delphine and RSF are trying to find a way to deal with that, but that is an incredibly important aspect of what we're all talking about. We're not just to have the Brits and the Americans and so on taken care of, but actually more importantly, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and so on.
And absolutely, this is a global call. We want to extend these standards. We started out with international freelancers as the rough term we're using, but we want to see it expand to local journalists as well. Everybody should have these understandings with editors, insurance, that kind of stuff. And for people who aren't journalists, the medical insurance that Reporters Without Borders offers, they offer very affordable medical insurance if you get injured and need to be evacuated or some kind of treatment in any country. Syria, Afghanistan, anywhere, they've created this pool, Reporters Without Borders, where you can get this insurance, and it doesn't pay much, that's true, but it's a great resource. It's just another example that there are some good things and some great resources out there. Another question. This is David Milliken, who's the bureau chief here for Agence France Presse, one of our signatories.
Yeah, just a quick question for Lily about the pay. And I'm just wondering if in those calculations, is there some way of separating out, what are you considering the danger pay part of that? And the $400, for example, is that a 100% on top of what you would consider a normal day rate? Is it a 25% increase? Is there something just to be able to kind of apply that in different spaces? And
we were speaking specifically about working in conflict zones. So we're not looking at non-conflict at all, if that answers your question. It would be $400 day rate for working in a conflict zone. You mean like depending on what your base rate is, how much more should you be paying danger pay-wise?
yeah, I mean, you had to start with some base there. I mean, 400 didn't come out of the blue. I mean, there must have been some notion of, you think a normal pay is $300 a day, and if you're in a conflict zone, there should be an extra $100 or 25% more, or there should be 50% more or something. I was just wondering if that was...
Yeah, we didn't, I mean, we came up with that number based on this survey of our alumni and other conflict journalists, and that was kind of like some people, especially people of Ron's generation, were saying, that's lower than what I was paid in the 1990s. That's way too low. And some people said, like, that's a lot more than I'm making now, and I'm willing to work for less. So again, it was a huge range, and that you know, Allison said that's a good base. So we kind of brought it to the middle, you know, we compromised.
Yes.
Sorry, just a follow-up on that question, which is not just the day rate, but it's the number of days that they assign you for the task. And I wondered whether you'd heard, but I've heard talking to videographers that there are certain broadcasters that say, okay, we'll pay you the going day rate, but now they're shortening the number of days on assignment. So the videographer is getting squeezed, not because of the day rate, but because they now have to do the work in 3 days instead of 5.
Is that true?
Yeah,
Panelists?
or could you take this day off because we're not shooting on that one? So if you could just not be paid for that day that you're not at home anyway, that would be great, you know. Great for who? So yeah, that's true. But I think the day rate is less important than whether the expenses are paid in addition as well. I tend to think there's not an appropriate amount of money to pay someone as danger pay. You know, what's your life worth? An extra $100 a day, really? You know? But paying for your fixer, who can be up to $600 a day, you know, and the car for $200 a day, and the insurance and the training and all of these things, you know, even the direct costs that you're actually paying in cash on the day can sort of get up to at least $1,000, and that's before you've even paid your rent back home and your ticket out there.
Just one thing on, and I'm a Reuters employee, and just to be fair to news organizations, this will be talked about in the next panel. There is obviously, though, a huge crisis in terms of the business model in journalism. These aren't sort of evil editors who are sitting on piles of cash. And I just want to say, in creating the guidelines, there is real concern among editors about how, you know, they have smaller budgets than in the past, but more danger than ever. It's more costly than ever to report safely on the ground, and they have less resources. And how do you balance the two? So there's very good outlets that, you know, we're not going to get into naming people that actually are treating people well and paying well. There's some that don't do that so much. So I just want to praise organizations for what they're trying to do, and say it is a difficult atmosphere.
There are some news organizations who are rapidly expanding their foreign departments. So
that's even better news, everybody.
You know, it's possible to make money making news.
We'll leave that to the next panel. I'm sorry, you had a question.
My name is Ole Orseth. I work here as a freelance correspondent in DC. And back in Norway, I've been involved with the Norwegian Journalism Federation there. They actually have come up, they're struggling with the exact same problems with pay and underpayment particularly. What they have made there is actually something called a freelance calculator. It's basically a spreadsheet where you can actually put in everything and come up with a decent sum for what it actually would pay to send someone from the newsroom out and argue that one in to the newsroom when they hire a freelancer. Because it's easy for them to pay like $100 or $50 for a picture. But if they were to send someone from their homeroom or their newsroom actually out, that would be quite a bit more expensive. And that helps actually visualize for freelancers and people in the newsroom what the cost actually is. So if anyone is interested in something like that, just contact me afterwards and I'd be happy to point you in the direction. Because there you put in all the overheads and they even have a baseline there where you can compare to every newsroom in Norway what the average salary is, and then you can calculate out from there.
I don't know if you guys find this as well, but I find it quite often, having been a stringer in a particular area. You know, there's no money for freelancers, we can only pay you this, that, or the other. But we're going to send a 6-person staff team next week, all on it with, you know, with a pocket full of expenses and a hotel room and the best fixer in the business. But, if you write for us, we might be able to give you $200. So there is money. It's just how it's being chosen to be spent.
Another question in the back. Go ahead. Actually, if we can first in the back. You go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Mahavashtaki, and I work at Internews. We are a local I mean, we're an international NGO focused on media development, but we're based here in Washington, D.C. My question is a little bit different from the topic that I've heard this morning, which is about pay and insurance, which is obviously very key and important. But we work to train journalists on how they can protect their digital communications and also protect their data, so more from on a tech perspective. I was wondering if there are any services or if you've sat in any trainings that have been available to you as a freelancer to be able to help you understand how you could protect your voice online as well as your communications and your data as you go about doing your work. Thanks.
Just one thing, the guidelines do actually include the journalists saying they will try to get training and think about digital security as well. But where can you get training in digital security?
Emma, you've spoken about this before.
Yeah, there's loads of digital security training. We've done a webinar with Roy Peck Trust and with Kim, who's over there, who knows a lot about this topic. And some of it's just the basic stuff. So that was a pretty entry-level webinar. There's all sorts of, digital security in a box kind of products available online. We've got a sort of roundup of some of the digital security resources on our website. So does Roy Peck Trust, has some amazing resources available for freelancers to sort of plug in and make sure that they understand that. It's kind of one of those things that people need to talk through sometimes because not everyone is tech savvy, but there's all sorts of trainings that go on both online and in person that people are able to access. It's just looking in the right place for them, I think.
So we've talked a lot about pay, but
Can
I
you
think...
introduce
Oh,
yourself?
sorry. My name is Courtney Raj. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Just from personal experience, when I was freelancing before getting into press freedom, there were a lot of outlets that would say, "Oh, well, we're not going to pay you. I mean, it's the exposure. Don't you want to get published?" And I was wondering, how do you deal with that when there isn't even payment, and how do you, try to even get payment in this digital environment? And do you think that this initiative will create more of a divide between kind of the people who can make a living doing journalism and then further the divide between citizen journalists and, amateurs?
Well,
Ron?
I wouldn't say maybe going back to citizen journalism, but maybe going back to the way that, journalism started with very wealthy people that didn't need to get paid for their work, traveling around and doing stories and taking pictures. And I think certainly in the photography world, there are a lot of trust fund kids that are doing work. Not that they're doing bad work, but they don't have to rely on the market to survive. But the idea of people using exposure, which is especially for photographers, is almost like for me almost a daily email from somebody saying, "Can we use this photograph and I'll give you credit and look how great that is." And the response is pretty much like, so, I ask them, are you getting paid for your job? And if they are, the conversation goes a different way. If they're saying like, no, I'm doing a pro bono project and it's something that I believe in, then yeah, I'll find a way or I'll give the photographs for free. But I think this idea, especially now of exposure being equivalent to pay, is a very dangerous road for photographers, especially young photographers, because exposure now doesn't mean what it used to mean. It's such a fragmented media environment that it doesn't mean just because you're getting on a website that your career is going to dramatically improve. But what will happen is that you're devaluing your photographs. And so it's, again, going back to this idea, and this is not just for photographers, it's for all freelance journalists, is that this is a business, and you have to treat it like a business. And if you don't, you'll probably survive, especially if you come out of college, on your savings or whatever for 2-3 years in your waitress or bartender job, and then eventually you won't be a journalist anymore. And it's pretty simple.
And Ron, wait a minute. You're getting requests every day?
I'd say
for an image for
almost
free?
every day. Can I use this? Can I have that? I have no budget. Can you help me? So on. And they're from organizations, and they're from bloggers and so on. It varies, and you have to parse through it and decide what you do and what you want to give away and what you're going to negotiate for. But it really especially in the NGO world, I find incredibly insulting when a communications director who's on a six-figure salary is saying, don't you believe in telling the story about malnutrition? Can I have your work for free? It's like, yes, of course I believe in it, and I want the word to get out there, but let's find a, I'm not going to charge you the same amount as I would to a Time magazine or something, but let's be serious about this. And it's a matter of us as a group training these people, because I think that there are so many people just giving the work away that photography, especially more so than writing and even more so than video, is like everybody has a camera and everybody assumes like it's not hard to take a picture, and there's no value to it. And we ourselves are helping that perception.
And you're getting more of those requests than you did 5 or 10 years ago for free content.
No, it's been.
And you then you talked about a change where the ranks of photographers could shift, where essentially only wealthy people can do that. Do you see that already happening? Are there people who've given up, who don't have the money to finance this and have left photography?
Absolutely. I mean, when you reach a certain point in your life, age-wise, responsibility-wise, then photography can no longer support you. I mean, there's a big difference between being able to survive, even on a New York Times day rate, which is, what, $200? And you can do that in your 20s, and you can't do that later on in life.
Here.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Mendez from Freedom House's Emergency Assistance Program. And one thing, just hearing what everybody's saying is, I'm wondering, how do we more visually or more explicitly explain both to ourselves and others what the cost of, pay, et cetera, and equating that with security? Because you've all touched on that, but being very explicit, if you're not paid properly, you don't have secure transport. You're not staying in a secure environment, hotel, whatever it is. You may not be able to take on a fixer. You may be cutting corners. Like, how do all of us, based on our experience, lessons learned, whether you're photographer, journalist, an organization that deals with emergency assistance to journalists in various ways, how do we push that forward so we have stories, we have examples, we're very explicit, so it's almost like a visualization. This is what it costs, $400 a day. And I know, like, back in the 90s, journalists, photographers, et cetera, were all saying, because that was a day rate back then too, arguing this is not enough because, so how do we all collectively do that? So it's clear it's not just about, this is what I get and I have to manage it. These are the consequences. You don't have insurance, you endanger your colleagues, et cetera.
I find it quite a good way to do it is to ask the editor if I could please have their January wages in advance now, and then I'll give them their January wages back in January. Thanks very much. So I made a film in August of last year, stumped up $5,000 in costs because it was commissioned. They were paying my insurance and a day rate, but they wouldn't give expenses in advance. So it cost $5,000 to make the film. And I didn't get paid until January. So there's 4 months that I don't have $5,000 of my money that I earned doing a different job. So that means that September, October, November, December time, while I'm waiting for that $5,000 back plus my wages, that's $5,000 I don't have to spend on a fixer or a driver or a safer hotel. So it means when I go out to work in September, I'm going to be cutting costs. I'm going to use, the least expensive driver because there's $5,000 that I don't have in my pocket. And to me, that when you explain it to someone in those terms, could you advance me your January salary and then I'll give it back to you in January plus, a bit extra. Then they start to go, oh yeah, that sounds really bad. I don't want to do that. But that's what we're being asked to do.
Which are a guarantee or...
And a 30-day payment term. So, had I been given that $5,000 in advance and then 30 days after the film was completed, been given my rate, okay, fine, no problem. But as it was, you sit there financing a news organization a substantial sum of money to an independent contractor for 4 months while it's, I don't know, sitting in their bank account accruing interest, which seems really bizarre. So those should be easy wins. You know, that's not asking for more money. That's just asking for, you know, a workflow that doesn't rely on me as an individual freelancer bankrolling you as a large news organization to produce your content.
And what does it cost to have your own driver, a fixer? I mean, if you're going into Syria.
We've produced some stuff, it's on our website, and we're going to advance it, where we talk to freelancers about what the costs are. My fixer in Syria is $600 a day.
$600 a day.
Yeah.
If I could read a comment from our survey, this is from a very experienced freelance. She's a writer. She said, I was recently in Baghdad where the cost of working is $350 US per day. That is $150 for the hotel inside a compound with T-walls and armed guard, plus $100 each for the driver and fixer. The driver has to stay with the car at all times to prevent anyone from planting a bomb, and the fixer is not just a translator, but for negotiating checkpoints and preventing kidnap, etc. So it's like, I think you have a great idea. I mean, Emma has stories, everyone has stories. We have a ton of stories from our survey, but it's like things that are happening privately between the editor and the freelancer, but the general public doesn't really know. I mean, if that's what you're trying to say, like some kind of graphic, not to name and shame anyone, just for the freelancer themselves, like to make, you know, Joe Schmo freelancer, this is the cost. Some kind of basic graphic, I don't know.
And should we be trying to educate the reading public about what is happening as well? Because, you know, people stopped buying caged hen eggs when they realized that the caged hens were having a bad time. And people started buying free trade coffee when they realized that there was some poor man in Guatemala who couldn't feed his children. So, you know, if the reader of, you know, whatever publication it is realizes that, you know, the page that they just read was ripped off somebody's blog, then perhaps they might think twice, and they might be a bit happier to pay for a copy of the paper, and they might be, you know, rather than reading it online or to get the digital subscription. So perhaps it's, you know, maybe we need to be fair trade freelancers, cage-free freelancers.
Just David,
Sure.
Just to follow up, like going back to what you were saying about the changes over the course of the last 20 years in connection to Cheryl's question. One of the big things that's happened for photographers has been that we used to be given assignments. And when you were given an assignment by Time Magazine was then responsible for you from the time you got in the car to go to the airport to the time that you came back, meaning that they were responsible for your insurance, your evacuation, all your expenses, plus your day rate. And then they were very conscious of those expenses, and there'd be conversations, how much is the hotel, how much do we have to spend on this, and you would find something that works within the budget of your client. Now, when you're selling photographs for $25, $50, $100 a picture, and you're not on assignment, and there's no real responsibility from any of the clients towards the freelancer, then this is where this becomes incredibly unwieldy, where you're taking risks to get a better picture because you have to pay your fixer $600 because you can't go there and lose money and so on, and it kind of adds to a whole level of insecurity, both in terms of your physicality in the place, but also your survival as a working journalist.
Thanks. Right here in the front row.
Barbara Cochran, Missouri School of Journalism, and I want to turn the conversation toward journalism students who I often talk to who aspire to become photojournalists. What kind of training, what kind of courses should they be taking in journalism school to prepare them? And what should journalism schools be offering that would better prepare them for the field? A course in negotiating comes to mind just from hearing this conversation.
Well, I think risk and a hostile environment course should be taught in all journalism schools. So when you graduate, you're ready to go. Whether you in journalism school know what you want to do or not, it should be an automatic thing. I think that's a huge push that all educational institutions teaching journalism should be doing. And then the idea about treating it as a business, I think should also be incorporated. But I think one of the most important things and these are not like semester-long courses. Risk is 4 days. You add hostile environment awareness, you're talking about a week in a university, and you're graduating somebody that is ready to go out there.
And Emma, FFR is working on a kind of standardized curriculum for training.
For the training. So we're working on a proposal which would sort of bring together, a standardized set of training, so that if a student did it in their journalism course with a provider that was providing the approved set of modules, they would have something that would not only increase their safety, but increase their employability. Because, thinking about things from an employability point of view is very helpful. Doing courses like pitching, get the work would be really helpful. I would personally suggest backpacking around Central America for your summer break a couple of times. What scares me is these kids who finish journalism school and they've done a hostile environment course, but they've never lived outside of an apartment that their parents were paying for, and they want to go and be a foreign correspondent, so they go to Libya. And they don't know how to make their own breakfast, So there's sort of something to be said for just like living a little bit,
In the back row, in the white jacket.
Hi, Firdaus Al-Farouk. I'm with the Press Freedom Committee here at the National Press Club. I just wanted to make a shameless plug. Earlier you were talking about cybersecurity. We're actually going to be hosting a couple of cybersecurity courses here at the Press Club over the next couple of months. We did hold a couple of courses last year, so if anybody's interested in learning about cybersecurity, encrypting your emails, protecting your sources, using Tor for research and stuff like that, do keep an eye out for these courses coming up. So,
thank you. We like shameless plugs. Over here.
Miles Smith from IREX. We provide digital, physical, and psychosocial training for freelancers and other journalists in 12 countries. And one of the things that we've found is that a lot of these folks are competing with folks from the West who have the J-School training, who have either the trust fund backing them up, or they are living off their savings as a bartender or a waitress. And I just wanted to hear the panel discuss that, the competition between you guys, the people who are based here, and the people who are based in those countries, and how that's changed in recent years, and how that affects things like pay, insurance, the end of the assignment from your bureau. Thanks.
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious when you go to certain countries that there is a gulf in training, and that's a problem. And everywhere that I've spent a significant amount of time, I have always tried to pass along jobs to local photojournalists when I feel that the skill level matches the needs of the job. And fortunately, there are more organizations out there like you guys and others. I think Internews is also doing work with local journalists, and there's a lot more capacity building in that arena, but there needs to be a lot more. And I think until that happens, it's just going to continue to be a gulf. So I think it's important for us all to be talking about that for sure.
I think there's a recognition amongst news organizations that they can't use local journalists as cannon fodder anymore, that it's not acceptable to sort of say, well, Westerners aren't able to go there, so we'll let the local chaps do it, and if something happens to them, they were living in a war zone anyway, so like whatever, and there has been a real effort in some of the places I've been to try and train local journalists, not just journalistically, but in safety as well. And it kind of baffles me that news organizations aren't better at doing that, because in a lot of instances, their staff are trained and they're there with a local journalist or fixer who is not trained in safety and security. And if something happens to the journalist, that's the person that's going to save their life, So that kind of medical training for local journalists is hugely important for everybody that's working in that environment. But particularly in countries where conflict has broken out and there hasn't previously been a free press, the agility of some of the organizations in this room to sort of jump in and train folks up on, journalistic principles
is a hugely important part of that process, to move them from activist to journalist. Because a lot of them have a camera and they're an activist and they're really keen, but you can't trust what they're saying. So, capacity building them from that perspective is super important.
And just Reuters had a tragic case of a young Syrian photographer who was killed, and it's really led to a whole revamping of the way they work. We're working with younger journalists. There's much more focus now on training those journalists, and an ideal, and this is that regular freelancers, whether they are local journalists or international freelancers, should be considered roughly the same and get the same treatment as staff people. And not to be too defending the industry, but every news organization has had a tragedy at this point. They've had a death or a kidnapping or a severe injury. And there really is introspection among editors about how to do this better. But when we need to do it better, this is a huge challenge, for the whole industry. And one of our goals also is to publicize the training that's out there. Delphine from RSF, who's here somewhere during the break, is trying to map out all of the different cyber training classes that exist, all of the different, there's gender training, which we're going to ask about soon. There are a lot of opportunities that young freelancers don't know about for support and for training, and we're eager to map that out and then make it more easily available to freelancers.
And sorry, just a bigger focus on employability in that area would be really great. So, having lived on the Syrian border for a period of time and seeing what happened to the local journalists and activists there, which was that a lot of them became professional conference attendees. And they learned, journalistic ethics 15 times from 15 organizations, and yet they didn't have a job at the end of it. It wasn't entirely helpful for anybody, So it would have been better to handpick a half a dozen or a dozen, pull those resources, train them in what being a journalist means, train them in safety and security, mentor them through an organization so that when everybody leaves, there are 12 working journalists who are able to contribute to international publications, who are able to tell the story of their country in an appropriate way, rather than just a bunch of kids who got a lot of free lunch.
So we'll go for just another 5 minutes. We have a question here.
I'm Wes Pippert. I worked in the Middle East for a while, and when I got back, I surveyed some colleagues about what their preparation they wished they might have had before they went. And it was a bit surprising because what they wanted to know was not more about computers, but more about such things as cross-cultural relations, which are so incredibly important in the Middle East, or a bit of the recent history in that whatever area you're going to, or even something about the basic economy and trade and that sort of thing, as what's going on in that area. And then beyond that, later, such things as how to survive. And my favorite example, I guess Donna mentioned, was take pencils, because ballpoint pens don't work when your paper's wet.
And that's sort of this theme of, and you're all saying it, but just, so should young journalists not go to conflict zones? Is that the panel's advice? We did it. So, what is your advice in terms of young journalists?
Well, I think you should go to a conflict zone if it's just something that you believe in. You don't go to a conflict zone for your career. And David and I were on a panel a couple months ago, and I think probably the best quote is from the foreign editor of the New York Times, who said that he was much more interested in looking at the portfolio of a young photographer that had done an in-depth story rather than looking at a week in Libya, a week in Syria, a week in Iraq. That didn't really interest him at all. And I think that that's a pretty good indication of what the market's looking for. They're looking for photographers that have an individual voice, that are dedicated to a story. But I would add that if you are dedicated and you believe in documenting human rights abuses in Syria, then you should figure out the best way to do that. And some of the first steps are what we've talked about: taking a risk class, taking a hostile environment class, being properly prepared, and understanding what you're doing. It would be hypocritical for me to say, don't do what I did. But do what I did, but do it better, because I did it incredibly poorly.
Yes, Rob.
So we don't have any representatives of the organizations that buy the work that you produce here, but I wanted to ask you, how do we drive these new principles into the newsrooms? What do we need to do to get a change in behavior in the new companies that are emerging, that are buying your work, into the sort of content-hungry new internet companies? The companies that have signed on to this call are taken care of, if you like. They're there. They've got a standard. How do we get this into the newsrooms of the other ones? Because you, Emma, said, you know, you mentioned battery hens, right, and raised the smile. But I mean, in part of the way that you get a change there is by naming and shaming the bad actors in that field. Yet we have tiptoed around naming and shaming the people who underpay you. Do you think that will have to be a strategy for driving change in those newsrooms, or is there some other way to get people to part with more money than they're doing at the moment?
Well, being slightly controversial in my, as opposed to my normal self, there was one of the things that the freelancers said to me when I told them I was doing this panel was, when are we going to address the hypocrisy of the news organizations that sit around and, you know, wring their hands about freelance safety and pay people $200 a day, including expenses. So, yeah, we would want to be not only naming and shaming, but also congratulating, because there are some organizations that are doing really well. And part of this conversation should be about news organizations not being scared that taking part in this conversation is just going to be about beating them with sticks in the paper when they do something wrong, but also about a collaborative, you know, and useful conversation, which means that everybody gets what they want, which is that we get work well paid in a safe way, and they get content that they increasingly need from us. So we're sort of hoping to do a, you know, carrots and sticks kind of arrangement where we get to a point where the people who have really improved, you know, and people like Story Hunter who do insurance for anybody that's commissioned through their website. I mean, that's brilliant, and that's something that should be celebrated. And, you know, organizations who have stepped up to the mark, who are insuring freelancers and putting them on assignments and sending them off to do good work should be congratulated for that, and it should be seen as a positive thing. But conversely, we should be getting to a point where we are able to, you know, say to the people who are not doing that, that's terrible. I mean, I had one of my previous editors who, I'm not going to name them, but they were paying me $100 a piece in Syria and $25 a photo, say, oh, you know, dear, any of the stuff you're doing about journalist security, you just add my name to that list. And I was like, you know, because she cares, like as a human, she cares. But, you know, the paycheck doesn't replicate what she's doing. So I was sort of like, well, I'm not going to put your name on any lists. But, you know, eventually I'd want to be able to say, this person's paying people this much, you know. But let's start the conversation in a positive way where nobody's worried about the fact that this is going to be an adversarial relationship. Let's see how far we can get in a collaborative and cooperative way to get to where we want to go before we sort of get the torches out.
Go ahead, John.
John Denishevsky from AP. I'd just like to add that this last question has touched on one of the main reasons for developing the call, that we want this to become a sort of a standard that freelancers can wave in the face of editors. This is the best practice. This is what legitimate, responsible, respectable news organizations do. And yes, there's an obligation on the part of the organizations to take it to heart. And I hope that every organization that has signed on is living up to it. And, you know, I think in some cases, the freelancers should just turn down work. I know that's a difficult economic decision in some cases, but turn down work from organizations that aren't responsible on these issues.
Thank you. The one thing the guidelines don't contain is some reference to gender. We do have a majority female panel here. Just in terms of photojournalism, are there particular disadvantages to being a woman and operating as a photojournalist these days? Advantages? What are the challenges for women photojournalists?
I think for what I do, it's a benefit in the sense, a lot of what I do is women's health issues, and I don't think I could do half of what I do as a male. The downside of that is that it's very difficult to find a female fixer in a lot of these places who can go with me in these situations, because women are not, often going to open up to a male translator, and so therefore, this person has to be a woman. And it is tricky sometimes to go into a place where, maybe the woman, you find somebody educated enough who speaks the language, but maybe their husband won't let them, doesn't trust your group, doesn't want them to be out with strangers, and, you can't find a fixer in that neighborhood. So I think that there are pros and cons to both things. And as far as conflict zones, that's another story. But for what I do, I think it can be a net positive.
For me, it saved my life at least once, being able to be hidden. I think where it becomes, sort of in the field, there's a massive, almost majority in some places of female journalists. Where it becomes problematic is, as it does in any industry, which is your sort of glass ceiling. Which is that the female presence in our industry tops out at a certain level. And the number of female foreign editors, female commissioners, the females making the decisions is fewer. And those sort of male editors sometimes come at the female reporters with sort of preconceived ideas about, what little ladies should be doing. So, seeing some of those women progress into the higher levels of the news industry would be wonderful to see.
And Lily, and then the last thing, we'll break for about 20 minutes. Risk just did a training in Ukraine, and in the end, it really is local journalists who are in the most danger, who don't have any training and don't get paid enough. What is the situation like in Ukraine for local journalists?
Yeah, so we just did a training a couple of weeks ago. We trained 24 Ukrainian journalists, again, mostly photographers, also camera operators. It's extremely dangerous for them working in the east, in the conflict zone. And the culture has become such that a lot of them are wearing the right equipment, so they have the flak jackets and the helmets, but they don't have any training. I mean, the level of training is very low as far as safety and hostile environment courses. There are some bubbling up because, the country is mobilizing, so there are a lot of soldiers willing to train the journalists. But it's not, no one's really accrediting these organizations as, the right providers. So when we went, everyone was extremely grateful to be getting this kind of training. And also just a couple of weeks before we went, a journalist there, Sergei Nikolaev, was killed in a very similar way as Tim Hetherington. So he had it's not clear what happened, but there's actually a horrible video online that shows him, still alive but dying, and a bunch of journalists around him with no idea what to do. And everyone has their helmets and they have their flak jackets, but no one has training. And so again, it's just awful that is happening, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere. But
Great. Well, thank you, all of you. Thank you for your work, and thank everyone who came here today. We'll break until 10:55 for the next panel. And I want to recognize Jorge Luis Serra, who brought us our 2 new signatories last night. He's a journalist that's helping spread this. Thank you all very much.
And you are all invited to that dinner. And we hope that at that dinner, Austin Tice and Jason Rezaian can be here to collect these Press Freedom Awards in person. And we're going to work every day between now and then to add our voices with all of you to make sure that that happens. Thank you so much, and now I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Chuck Lewis.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event, and it's wonderful to be here. We have folks from literally different parts of Europe and different cities in the U.S. All here, we've all been discussing for months these issues of how to make life safer for journalists in the world, freelance journalists in particular, and we'll hear far more about that throughout the program. Right now, I'd like to introduce Barbara Cochran, who is a longtime veteran journalist, former CBS News Bureau Chief, professor at the moment at the University of Missouri, former president of the Radio and Television News Directors Association, and president of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. It's great to see you bright and early this morning. I think considering what the traffic is like in Northern Virginia, there may be others straggling in later on. As John Hughes said, one of the mandates of the journalism of the National Press Club Journalism Institute is press freedom. And this is something that's always been part of our mission, which is to provide professional development and educational programming for the members of the press club and for other journalists. And we provide more than 50 programs every year that help journalists freshen their skills, explore important issues. And so the idea that we are now expanding our mandate to not only support press freedom through advocacy, but also to enhance our programming and increase our programming offerings in this area is really very, very important. And of course, what could be more essential to press freedom than the safety of journalists? So that's why having newly received this larger
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. My name is John Hughes. I'm an editor for Bloomberg First Word. That's our breaking news desk here in Washington. I'm also the president of the National Press Club, and I want to welcome you today to this great event, this important event where we're really working to save lives, protect freelance journalists, and that's a very important thing for all of us to be doing. We don't need to say why it's important, because the video that we've seen, the news reports from the Middle East, the horrific stories, that's why we're here today. I know there are many organizations represented here. Our club's Journalism Institute is working with the Investigative Reporting Workshop and the Committee to Protect Journalists. We also have members of our Press Freedom Committee here. Raise your hand if you're on the National Press Club Press Freedom. Okay, very good. And this is a very important function of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the press freedom work that we do. So we decided to make press freedom a much larger part of what the Institute does by moving the programs from the club over to the Institute. And this really is a kickoff to getting that started. And we're very excited for this program today. Now, before I finish, I want to do a little bit of breaking news. We're announcing, the National Press Club today is announcing that we're giving one of our most prestigious awards. This is the John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award, and we're giving this to Austin Tice. He's an American freelance reporter who's been detained in Syria since 2012. It is uncertain who holds him, but we believe that Austin is alive. He is sharing this award with Jason Rezaian of the Washington Post, who is being held in a Tehran jail. We are announcing these awards early to shine a spotlight on the plight of these two men, to raise our voices, to tell the world these men are journalists, they're doing their jobs, they should not be held, and they must go free. We're going to keep raising our voices. We're going to keep the pressure on, and we're going to keep supporting programs just like this to protect journalists and to ensure that this doesn't happen to any other people. We have a large gala dinner here at the Press Club in the summer where we give out these Press Freedom Awards. This year it will be July 29th over in the ballroom.
So that's a brief overview of the needs. We've assessed the needs. Now comes the hard part. How do we meet them? I hope that today we'll get some answers to that. Thank you very much.
Before introducing our next speaker, I do want to say hello and acknowledge Diane Foley, and we're honored by your presence here. And thank you. So anyway, David Rode is our next speaker. He's not your typical journalist. It's fair to say he has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He was taken hostage a few years ago in Afghanistan for 8 months and escaped. A remarkable story, a remarkable career. And anyway, David is now at Reuters after a time for years at the New York Times. So anyway, David, without further ado, we will then discuss freelance photography, an aspect that's been neglected, frankly, in some of the earlier conversations going back to August and September, and that's the subject of this panel. And we have some distinguished panelists who, obviously, David will introduce. So without further ado, David. Thanks.
I'm going to quickly speak, but our panelists are going to have a seat here, and then I will moderate a conversation with them about photojournalism. What I wanted to do is just thank first John and Julie and everyone from the National Press Club for arranging this, and Chuck Lewis has done an amazing job literally making all this happen. It all started with Chuck. It was an anonymous donor who wanted something to be done in the wake of the murder of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff that resulted in us being here today. My sort of quick update is I'm just sort of thrilled and amazed at where we are in terms of these guidelines. A small group of us gathered in Chicago. Initially, it was a meeting arranged by the AP managing editors. John Danishevsky from AP is here, and the International Press Institute. John Yearwood, who's sitting here as well, helped arrange that conversation. And we never thought we would be able to draft guidelines, let alone get people to sign on. We unveiled the guidelines, or the call, I should say, on February 12th at Columbia University in New York with roughly 24 signatories. We nearly tripled that number in the last 2 months. I'm incredibly proud and happy to say we now have over 60 signatories. Last night we got 2 more signatories.
Mandate to have the very first event be something that we're sharing with the Investigative Reporters Workshop and the Committee to Protect Journalists, and all of you who've gathered together in an informal way to discuss this important topic. It's a great honor, a great privilege for us, and we're very, very happy that you're here today. Now I'll turn it back to Chuck.
Obviously, the last 2 years in this world of ours has been the most dangerous ever documented for journalists, which is why we're here. And there's no greater expert on the status of safety in the world for journalists than Robert Mahoney, who is here from New York, from the Committee to Protect Journalists, who before joining CPJ did reporting in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And so, and he also has something to announce today regarding a certain publication. So welcome, Rob. It's great to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Thank you also to the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and to Chuck and his team, and to all of you that have made this possible. My job here is actually a sad one, but it's also a necessary one, which is in a way to frame the discussion that we're going to be having later with some facts and figures on the situation for journalists and for journalism around the world. And when I quote statistics, I understand that behind every statistic is a person, maybe a colleague, a friend, a loved one that we have known. But it's true, in the last 3 years, from 2012 to 2014 at least, it's probably been the most dangerous time to be a journalist. In that time, the committee has documented at least 205 deaths of journalists, and believe me, our figures are pretty conservative, so there's probably more that have died in that time. And the big difference now that we notice in terms of journalists that are killed in hostile environments is that many of them are actually targeted because of what they're doing as journalists. It used to be that foreign correspondents, as they were once called, had a certain status, that they could move across lines, that they could cover conflict without getting embroiled in that conflict. That, sadly, is fast becoming no longer the case. We have documented since the Syrian war broke out, for example, more than 90 hostage takings of journalists, and there are probably about 20 that we still believe are held captive. This is new. Journalists used to be taken hostage before, but there were far fewer numbers, and they were kept alive usually because there was some financial or political gain from holding a hostage that the abductors wanted. Unfortunately, that is not always the case now. And another interesting fact is that more and more foreign journalists are being killed, and more journalists are dying in crossfire. We reckon that about half of those journalists that are now being killed are freelancers. That's a significant change too. As news organizations have shrunk their foreign news operations and their footprint overseas, they rely more and more on freelancer-generated content for their news, and freelancers are paying the price of that. But the biggest group, as we all know, that take the brunt of this are local journalists. They're the ones that are left behind, even if the foreign journalists can leave. And of particular relevance to the panel that we're going to be having this morning, of the journalists that are dying or have been dying in the Middle East, about 6 out of 10 are in the visual field. About 4 out of 10 are camera operators, and 2 out of 10 are stills photographers. That also is an increase and reflects the dangers, because those journalists are the ones that do have to go to the front line. They do have to get the images. They do have to get the actuality, and they're the ones that are probably in more danger. So that's the framework in which we are here today. It's sad, but it has spurred us to try to do something. All of us in this room have done something. We give aid to journalists. We report on press freedom violations and the deaths of journalists, and we all do a little bit. Now I'm hoping that with this initiative, all those little bits can be brought together to make a big difference. The response has been great. It has opened up debate in the news industry. For the first time in a long time, we are questioning the wisdom of news blackouts when it comes to the abduction of journalists. The issue of ransom payment has come up, and the behavior of governments towards the families of journalists that have been abducted is also now a topic for discussion. And I'm hoping that I see some signs that there is a move afoot within the US government, for example, to change the way that it behaves so that families like the Foleys and Diane Foley never have to go through what they did again at the hands of governments when it comes to seeking help to get their loved ones out.